There is something in the wind that still carries Liverpool back to us. If you listen closely, you may hear it moving across the River Mersey at first light, touching the old docks, resting quietly against the Royal Liver Building, standing in the morning fog. Before we begin, I invite you to find a quiet place, somewhere still enough to let memory speak. Follow along on the screen, where these archival images may guide you gently into the past. They may not match every word, but they belong to Liverpool in the 1940s. If this story speaks to you, please consider subscribing to Tubular Retro and take a moment to like and share. Before the war, Liverpool lived to the rhythm of the river. The docks were never truly still. Ships arrived from across the Atlantic, heavy with cargo, their hulls pressed against the quays, while men moved with practiced strength along the waterfront. If you had stood there in those years, you would have heard the steady clatter of chains, boots striking damp stone, and voices carrying through the salt air. It was not just noise, it was a city at work. Much of that life rested on the shoulders of working men, many of them shaped by generations of labour, others newly arrived, drawn here by the promise of opportunity. Liverpool had long been a meeting place of people, Irish families, Welsh workers, sailors from distant ports, all finding their place within the same streets. You could see it in the faces, hear it in the accents, feel it in the way the city held together through difference. Walk a little further inland and the streets told another part of the story. Rows of narrow houses, washing strung between windows, children moving in and out of doorways, while men in flat caps made their way to early shifts. Life was not easy, but it carried a sense of order, of routine that gave people something steady to hold on to. Shops opened, markets filled, and neighbours knew one another in ways that feel distant now. Looking back, what stays with me is not just the scale of the port, but the quiet certainty people carried. There was work to be done, families to support, and a belief, perhaps unspoken, that tomorrow would look much like today. And in that ordinary rhythm, there was a kind of comfort, because none of them could have fully known how quickly that world was about to change. In the early days of September 1939, something changed in a way that could not be easily understood at the time. It did not begin with bombs or fire, but with quiet instructions, official notices, and a growing sense that children needed to leave the city. What followed was one of the largest evacuations ever carried out in Britain. If you had stood at the railway stations in Liverpool then, you would have seen lines of children waiting with small suitcases, some carefully packed by their mothers the night before. Labels were pinned to their coats, names and destinations written clearly, as if that might make the journey easier. Many did not fully understand where they were going, only that they were going without their parents. The platforms were crowded, yet there was a strange silence beneath the movement. Mothers stood close, holding hands a little longer than usual, adjusting scarves that did not need adjusting. Some tried to smile, to make it feel like an adventure. Others could not hide the tears. Fathers, often quieter, stood back, watching with a kind of stillness that said more than words ever could. When the trains finally began to move, the separation became real. Children leaned from windows, waving, calling out, trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. And those left behind remained on the platform, watching until the last carriage disappeared from view. It is difficult to measure that kind of moment. There were no headlines that could fully capture it, only a quiet weight carried by families who returned home to rooms that suddenly felt too empty. And for many, that was the true beginning of the war. Then, one night, the sky began to change. It did not happen all at once. At first, there was only the sound, a distant hum that seemed almost part of the wind. But those who lived through it would tell you, you learned to recognize that sound very quickly. It was followed by the rising wail of the sirens, a long, unsteady note that moved through the streets and settled into your chest. By late 1940, Liverpool had become one of the most heavily bombed cities in Britain outside of London. Its importance as a port made it a target that could not be avoided. The docks, that once brought life into the city now drew destruction toward it. When the raids came, they came at night. The blackout left the city in near total darkness, broken only by the sweep of searchlights crossing the sky. People moved quickly, often without speaking, making their way to shelters, to basements, to anywhere that felt even slightly safer. Doors closed, lights were covered, and the outside world became something distant and uncertain. Then the bombs began to fall. There are accounts from those nights that speak not of chaos, but of something more disorienting. The ground would shake, windows would shatter, and the air itself seemed to change with each explosion. Fires broke out across the city, lighting the streets in an orange glow that no one could forget. Buildings that had stood for generations were reduced to fragments in a matter of moments. During the intense raids of December 1940, often remembered as the Christmas Blitz, hundreds of lives were lost over just a few nights. And in May 1941, the attacks reached another devastating peak, with thousands of homes destroyed and tens of thousands of people left without shelter. These are not numbers that sit easily. They represent streets, families, and lives that were part of the city only days before. What stays with me as I reflect on these records is not only the destruction, but the experience of those who lived through it. People running through streets filled with debris, helping neighbors out of damaged homes, carrying what they could in the darkness. There was fear, certainly, but also a kind of steadiness that is difficult to explain. Because even as the sky fell, life did not completely stop. It held on quietly in the spaces between each siren and each night that followed. When we speak about those nights, it is easy to think in numbers, but the truth of Liverpool in the 1940s was never carried in statistics. It lived in individual moments, in lives that were changed quietly and permanently. There are records of rescue teams working through the early hours, long after the sirens had fallen silent. Men moved carefully over broken brick and splintered wood, listening for any sound beneath the rubble. Sometimes they heard a voice, sometimes only silence. Each space they uncovered told a different story. A table still set, a coat left by the door, small details that made the loss feel closer, more human. One of the most painful realities was that safety was never certain. Air raid shelters meant to protect did not always hold. On the night of the 28th of November 1940, a direct hit on a shelter at the Durning Road site led to a devastating loss of life. It remains one of the most tragic single incidents of the war in the city. For families waiting above ground, there was no way to prepare for what followed. Only the long hours of not knowing, and then the weight of what was found. Children, too, carried memories that stayed with them for a lifetime. Some recalled being pulled from the dust, disoriented, unable to fully understand what had happened around them. Others remembered the quiet that followed, the absence of familiar voices, the sudden change in spaces that once felt safe. These were not moments that faded easily. They became part of who they were. And yet, what stands out in so many accounts is not only the grief, but the way people responded to it. Neighbors helped one another without hesitation. Strangers became familiar through shared loss. There was no time to step back. Only the need to carry on, even when the cost felt too great. When we look back now, it is not the destruction alone that defines Liverpool in those years. It is the memory of those who endured it quietly, and the stories that remained long after the ruins were cleared. After the noise of the raids faded, what remained was something quieter, but no less demanding. Daily life had to continue, and for most people in Liverpool, survival became a careful balance of patience, discipline, and small acts of resilience. Rationing was introduced early in the war, and it shaped nearly every household. Basic foods like sugar, butter, bacon, and meat were strictly limited. Each family carried ration books, small and ordinary in appearance, yet essential to daily life. If you walk through those memories, you will see women standing in long queues outside shops, sometimes for hours, waiting their turn. Conversations were quiet, often practical. What could be stretched? What could be saved? What might last another week? Meals changed. They became simpler, smaller, and often repetitive. A table might hold little more than bread, vegetables, and whatever could be managed that day. Yet even in that simplicity, there was care. Mothers did what they could to make food feel like something more than necessity. A shared meal still carried meaning even when there was very little to share. Children adapted in ways that feel both remarkable and deeply human. They played wherever space allowed, often among the ruins left behind by the bombing. Broken streets became playgrounds. Pieces of wood, scattered bricks, anything at hand could become part of a game. There was laughter even there, not because life was easy, but because childhood has a way of continuing even in difficult places. Clothing, too, told its own story. Fabric was scarce, and people were encouraged to mend what they already had. Coats were patched, dresses altered, shoes repaired again and again. Nothing was wasted. Every item carried a longer life than it was ever meant to. Looking back, it is often these small details that remain the clearest. Not the grand events, but the quiet routines. The waiting, the making do, the way people adjusted without expecting recognition. It was not a life anyone would have chosen, but it was lived with a kind of steady dignity that still deserves to be remembered. Even in those years, when so much had been taken, people in Liverpool held on to something that could not be rationed. The need to feel alive did not disappear. It simply found quieter ways to exist. When evening came, and if the night was calm, some would make their way to dance halls. The rooms were often dim, the lighting soft, but inside there was movement, music, and a brief sense of escape. You could hear the rhythm of swing bands, the shuffle of shoes across worn floors, and laughter that felt almost surprising after the weight of the day. For a few hours, people allowed themselves to forget. Not completely, but enough to breathe a little easier. Football, too, remained part of that rhythm. Matches continued in a different form, smaller crowds, unfamiliar lineups, players often drawn from wherever they could be found. Yet when the ball moved across the pitch, something familiar returned. People gathered, stood together, and followed the game with the same quiet intensity. It was never just about the result. It was about holding on to something that still felt normal. And then there were the simplest moments. A shared smile between two people passing in the street. A conversation that lasted a little longer than expected. Couples walking side by side, finding comfort in presence alone. These were not grand gestures, but they mattered. Looking back now, it is clear that these small joys were not distractions. They were part of survival, a way of reminding themselves that even in the hardest of times, life had not completely slipped away. On the 8th of May 1945, the long wait that had settled over Liverpool finally began to lift. Victory in Europe was declared, and for the first time in years, the city allowed itself to breathe without fear of what the night might bring. If you had walked through the streets that day, you would have felt something shift in the air. People gathered slowly at first, then in growing numbers. Flags appeared in windows, voices rose, and the sound of celebration moved through the city in a way that had been absent for far too long. Along the River Mersey, ships sounded their horns, a deep echoing call that carried across the water like a signal that something had truly changed. Yet, what stands out most in the accounts is not only the joy, but the emotion beneath it. There were smiles, certainly, but also tears. Families who had waited for years, some reunited, others left with spaces that would never be filled again. People embraced in the streets, not always speaking, simply holding on to the moment. It was not a loud kind of happiness for everyone. For many, it was quieter, more reflective. A release of tension that had been carried for so long it had become part of daily life. And in that shared moment, Liverpool did not forget what it had endured. It simply allowed itself, at last, to feel something different. When the celebrations faded and the flags were taken down, Liverpool returned to something quieter. The war had ended, but its presence had not disappeared. It remained in the streets, in the buildings that no longer stood as they once had, and in the lives that had been altered in ways that could not be undone. If you walked through the city in those months, you would have seen the contrast clearly. Ruined walls, standing beside early signs of rebuilding. Empty spaces where homes had once been filled with voices. Work had begun, slowly and steadily, as men cleared debris and laid the first foundations of what would come next. But rebuilding was not only physical. People carried their own memories forward, some spoken, many kept quiet. There were routines to return to, jobs to find, families to support. Life moved on, as it always does, but not without reflection. What remains most striking is the sense of endurance. Liverpool did not rush to forget. It rebuilt step by step, holding on to what had been lost while making space for what could still be lived. As we come to the end of this journey, I find myself thinking less about the ruins and more about the people who carried it. If you stand by the waterfront today, especially as the sun begins to fall, you can still feel something of that time, quiet, steady, and close. For me, this story is deeply personal. It reminds us that history is not distant. It lives in memory, in places, and in people. Everything you have seen here is drawn from real historical records and trusted sources, shared only to remember, never to divide or provoke. I would truly like to ask you, how did this story make you feel? When you think about life then and now, what differences stand out to you? Please share your thoughts so we can reflect together. If this meant something to you, consider subscribing to Tube Euro Retro and take a moment to like and share. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.